Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nasser Al-Batal. I'll be introducing over this hour some introduction to some of the issues today that are basically causing pain for many different organizations and how we can deal with some of these issues from best practices, specifically when we start looking at enterprise architecture, business analysis, IT service management, and few actually other best practices that are not necessarily documented in here, but nevertheless, I will mention them along the way. So thank you for being here today. Again, my name is Nasser Al-Batal. I have been in the IT industry for over 25 years in many different capacities. Over the last, I would say, close to 20 years now, my focus is on IT service management and additional best practices, including enterprise architecture, governance controls, IT service management standards, and to the most recent additions of Lean and DevOps and the usual kind of buzzwords that you have in the industry today. My expertise ranges from consulting to coaching to training, and I've been doing this worldwide with a number of different organizations of all sizes. Throughout the years, I trained pretty much and consulted with organizations as big as NASA and as small as a mom-and-pop shop, you know, in IT and IT service management. Some of the discussions that we're going to cover over this hour associated with business needs, the right solutions. Do you have a framework, or what do you call your own framework? Enterprise architecture, some discussions on capability-based planning, business architecture, ITIL, COBIT, and as well as some of the skills that you will need to have along the way. So the situation today is that a lot of organizations are having, you know, many different issues, as you are very well aware of. In some cases, delivering your value as a business outcome. In other cases, sustaining your value over time. In other cases, the ability to actually have a good relationship management with your customers, or even having good business relationship management framework that you would use to have a good relationship with your customers. Also aligning or meeting regulatory requirements, amongst, you know, other ones, but the ones that are also very kind of much being discussed over the last couple of years in the industry, as you probably heard, you know, DevOps, in addition to, of course, Lean, you know, Agile, and Scrum. Now, the DevOps concept is a very important concept to kind of keep in mind. Although we have been talking about this over the years, but the discussion kind of went from one ear through the other, even though many other best practices discuss some of the same messages actually that DevOps, you know, talks about, but it didn't stick as much as DevOps itself did. So I do encourage you to stay in touch with CTC Trade Canada on future webinars where we will be talking about DevOps and Lean and Agile and how they will enable, you know, an organization to have a more aligned culture between development and operations teams, you know, how to minimize and or eliminate waste, and how to have a continuous delivery, continuous deployment, continuous improvement type of approach. So there are a number of many different frameworks that are today available in the industry, and they range from ITIL to TOGAF to security to COBIT and so on. Many, many different ones. The question is not, how many or, which one is the best, because at the end of the day, what you really are going to need, you need to make sure that you establish, some good order in your house to know which combination of frameworks you would have to put together to make it your own. Today, some organizations begin with ITIL, and then they add COBIT, and then they add enterprise architecture. Oh, wait a minute, we forgot about business analysis, or which project management approach we're going to take, and so on and so forth. This is to realize that as part of business transformation, you really need to establish some very basic pillars, right, within the organization. And in order to do so, you need to figure out what would be your framework. So you have to come up with your framework, not just, addition, of previous frameworks that you established and then add to them new ones, etc. Becomes a waste of time and effort and money. This is just to show you that there is, a level of overlap between different frameworks. So as an example, when we're talking about ITIL, specifically in service strategy, some of the same discussions are happening at the enterprise architecture at preliminary phases, as well as, the phase, as we call it, vision, right? And even, the phase that we call business, some little discussions on that. The same discussions are happening also in COBIT, at managing the IT management framework and making sure that we have an appropriate enterprise architecture. So again, some of these discussions are happening in multiple frameworks. They sound like a broken record. They sound repeated. You want to make an effort and consolidate all of these different, best practices to kind of come up with your own version, right? And make sure that it actually aligns with your business goals and objectives and enable your business strategy at the same time. So this is a very strong message that you need to keep in mind, as you leave the webinar today. Make sure that you establish your own framework. And again, because of overlaps, because of repeatability, because of duplication, because of many different, aspects that each one of these frameworks bring with them. What you see here, again, is again a combination of some of these activities, just to show you, as an example, in the yellow bubbles or in the yellow wheel, this is what we call architecture development method. It's based on the TOGAF, or the Open Group Architecture Framework. But along those activities, right, there is, of course, injections of many other practices, being it, governance, as an example, that we check for, also maturity that we check for, business analysis activities, that we exercise throughout some of these phases or stages, amongst, many other discussions. Again, change management, when you start duplicating activities, controls and governance, transition from an ITIL point of view, project management, and so on and so forth. So even though when we are using certain, enterprise architecture example here, very quickly we realize that we have a multitude of additional frameworks that are embedded or injected into that practice. The question, do they align with your business direction? This is your challenge, all right? Very important, to figure out, again, what would be your own framework. In addition to all of this, actually, before going forward, there is iteration discussions. For those of you who are familiar with TOGAF, there are certainly iterations discussions that happen at the phase level or at multiple phases or throughout the entire ADM, which are also injected with knowledge or with the concepts that are associated, as an example, with DevOps in certain areas, Lean in other areas, Scrum in other areas, and so on. So again, the same message, you're going to make sure to make it your own so that it enables your organization as much as possible. In terms of the open group architecture framework, this is an organization that actually is governing enterprise architecture best practice as is spun off out of a number of different ones, from Department of Defense architecture framework to technical management architecture framework, and so on and so forth, including some standards as well. At the end of the day, they collected all of this information and they came up with TOGAF as we know it. And over the years, of course, TOGAF went from originally version 7 to where we are today in version 9.1, right? We talked briefly about the architecture development method, which is the heart of the TOGAF framework. In terms of the big picture, as you see it here, TOGAF suggests that it's going to be the bridge between what the vision business or the business vision and drivers is going to be versus where we want to be or the desired state in terms of capabilities. And in order to get there, we pretty much are performing, right, all of those activities associated with the framework, mainly the architecture development method. Again, this is, the heart of the framework. Everything that we have, below that is actually in support of those activities. So on the left-hand side here, if I quickly create, let's call it the ADM wheel, right? Just quickly to show you some of the concepts that I'm talking about, you're going to have some sort of repository, where you're adding and you're using, artifacts from. You're going to have certain structures in those repositories based on your content framework. You're going to use some of the external references, right, or reference model, as well as your internal, right, reference model that you would establish as well, and so on. So all of this becomes kind of in support of what we call the ADM wheel. Now, in terms of the domains that the enterprise architecture is suggesting here, there are architecting for business, they're architecting for applications, they're architecting for data, and they're architecting for technical domains. 4 domains that are recognized by the open group in the current version. Potentially in the future, they may tweak and adjust some of this information. But today, also in terms of adaptation of those different domains, we're going to be talking as an example about security and about service-oriented architecture in relationships to all of these basic domains that are today part of the body of knowledge. This is quickly to show you some colors so that you don't say that the material is dry. But these are this is a reflection of the different concepts we just talked about. So the ADM wheel, the architecture development method, as I called it, the heart of enterprise architecture. Again, your content framework, some very high-level, quick example of reference models. And again, this is what TOGAF is suggesting. This is what we call technical reference model, and this is infrastructure information integration reference model. But don't forget that you also have external reference models that you can bring in, from the industry. And there is a number of those available depending on the kind of work that you're doing. We talked about, the ADM, but now you potentially have multiple ADMs dealing with each other or linking to each other. We talk about guidelines in terms of stakeholder and stakeholder management. This is a quick example where we have 5 categories, including 22 different types. So you need to know who you're working with or for, and who is the sponsor, who is the accountable, who is the manager, etc. Enterprise continuum is to establish the flow, right, of your building block evolutions from the very basic, or as we call it, foundation, all the way to the organization specific, which has the most details based on your organization needs and requirements. And eventually, at the end of the day, make sure that you have established the capabilities from an architecture framework perspective. This only is going to happen when you have the people, the processes, the technologies, and they are seamlessly kind of, right, integrated, right, and supported by your governance framework in order to make it all properly controlled and manageable. Another quick view on what your governance model may look like. And again, this extends a little bit beyond enterprise architecture. So at this point, enterprise architecture is making sure that we have the abstract, design and architecture. Eventually, it's going to be implemented through your PMO, right? And, it's going to be deployed through your IT service management, right? As you notice, in your continuum, you're going to have all the appropriate artifacts to enable you to do the governance associated with all of those different areas. A critical success factor here is to ensure alignment, right? Both right to left and left to right in or amongst these different practices and models. So this is another view just to say that we can iterate the activities, at a phase level, at multiple phases levels, or throughout the entire ADM, depending on what we have discovered, at the time of defining the architecture. You can iterate because of risk, because of formalities, because of cost, because of we didn't deliver what we were requested to deliver, because of many different reasons. One important concept here is when we talk about capability-based planning, which is really about ensuring that we are aligning, as we call it, people, process, technology, in effort to align with your business strategy from an enterprise architecture perspective. So basically, you're planning to ensure that your enterprise architecture is in proper alignment with your business strategy. And here is, at a high level, some basic kind of image to show you those relationships. So at the very beginning, our strategic plan is reflected, in the architecture vision, which is going to be the basis, for your corporate project portfolios. And then this is going to manage or create, again, outcome-oriented capability, which is based on capability increments and associated with deliverable building blocks. And that happens at, again, the different domains and the different phases of your ADM. And as you see, this is also reflective of some of the activities and or projects, right, that you are doing at a lower level. So technically speaking, using the architecture development method will enable you to deliver your business strategy at the highest level. Right? So this is pretty much a quick reminder in terms of what the domains are, right? The 4 domains is business, and then here we have application and data. They call it information system, but realistically there are 2. So here we've got 1, 2, 3, and technology is 4 in terms of what the focus of this activity is going to be. Now, at this point is to ensure that we have the capability and the readiness and the vision. At this point is to ensure that we can actually introduce the architecture out the door. At this point is to ensure that we can govern it and control the implementation, which will happen by, external management frameworks at this point. So after migration planning, we're done the architecture, and now we're looking at, implementation governance. We're looking at changes also internally and externally. And of course, don't forget about, collecting your requirement and making sure that you have a good understanding of all of this. The next few bullets are pretty much detailing what I just talked about. So for the sake of time, right? Phase A is your architecture vision. Phase B is your business architecture and your value chain, and basically how you're going to support and enable your vision and strategy, right? And this is pretty much the approach, right, of translating this business strategy into an actual, a program or a set of programs to be able to implement them, to your operational side of the house, right? Now, you're analyzing what you currently have, and you're trying to target a desired stage through the design. So your business architecture is pretty much enabling you to do that. It gives you that overall holistic approach, so that you can move on to the next step. There are a couple of areas that I just got to mention at a high level. So some of the considerations or some of the capabilities that you should have, as part of your business architecture is associated, as an example, the ability to do strategic analysis and planning, the ability to analyze your value chain and to optimize it, the ability to actually do appropriate modeling so that everybody is on the same page, everybody speaking the same language, and everybody is collaborating through that business transformation initiative. And of course, you want to make sure that you're aligning your target architecture also with the target solution. Otherwise, you want, potatoes will give you tomatoes, right? So there are different performance management outcomes associated with the framework, with the performance data, with the improvement, with the forecasting. You need to have the appropriate measurements to ensure that your performance indicators are reflective of what you need and want, and that your performance is up to par. So basically, what we're measuring eventually for effectiveness. We're measuring for, efficiency, and we're measuring for quality, right? These are things that you need to keep in mind to ensure that whatever, being put in front of your stakeholders is actually what they have looked for. So in terms of drivers, of course, accountability, want to make sure that the change benefit realization is captured, make sure that we have a continuous improvement approach, and of course that the information requirements in terms of what to use and how to use it to measure the performance is properly captured as well. All right. So there are a lot of these different discussions. These are the measurements and the performance classifications that I was talking about. Right. There are a lot of these concerns to make sure that we actually deliver what we were set out to deliver. It's very important to use models and modeling techniques because, as I mentioned, this becomes your common language. This becomes your reusable pattern. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you have an architecture a program or a project, right? You already have these things in place. You have established part of your artifacts, and basically is just reusing them if and when need be. And of course, this eventually is going to help you to build, what we call the suite of your business models that aligns with your policy and principles that you have or should have defined a little bit earlier. I'm sure you guys are familiar with some of these diagrams, just, to show you some pretty picture in terms of, as an example, you have use case diagrams, you have BPMN diagram, now you have, as part of the new introduction. As a matter of fact, it's been a couple of years, but recently, still kind of struggling to pick up some market speed. There is something we call Archimate. This is also part of the open group list of products, right? So it's architecture mate, and this is pretty much to align with enterprise architecture as well, speaking the same language, speaking the same lingo, if you wish, instead of using something like BPMN that use slightly different terminologies. So you will have a lot of different frameworks and reference models that potentially may be very useful for you. As I mentioned, earlier in the webinar, you have to figure out, how you make this relevant to your organization, right? You can't just, keep on adding framework after framework and duplicating some of the processes and some of the outputs and getting kind of lost in the level of details and who's who and what is what. You have to figure out, out of, as an example, all of this, what makes it your own, yes? And that's not an easy task to do, okay? Some of the different reference models, for those of you who are in the government, of course, there is the public sector reference model that has its language. And as by the way, for those of you who are not familiar, the federal government has actually inputted quite a bit of knowledge into the enterprise architecture world. And even, accredited for that by the open group. There is a public sector reference model as well in terms of management reference, federal enterprise architecture framework, and then you get into, some of the sub, if you wish, right? Government of Canada strategic reference model. This is what we've seen in the previous slide, business reference model, data reference model, and so on and so forth. So all of these different models, you can decide which one is best for you to follow or for you to use. In some cases, it's dictated, so it's not a matter of choice. It depends on who you are or what kind of organization you have, right? This is on the same note to say that pretty much the change requires collaboration and communication. And of course, having the appropriate models will enable, the clarity, the agreement, and eventually the transformation. This common language is straightforward, it's easy to capture, and, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can have a lot of documentation, that you have at hand, but it's not going to reflect, the point as much as one diagram as an example. So something to keep in mind and something to build the capacity within the organization, for as well. Now, we talked about enterprise architecture in general, but now you have different solutions, right? You have different systems. You have, considerations of interoperabilities or consideration of business patterns. You have considerations of cost. You need to make sure that all of those are aligned with, your solution at the end of the day. Something extremely important that a lot of people actually kind of underestimate. By the way, this is slightly older than the current version for business analysis. For those of you who are familiar with the body of knowledge, you would know that today this is V3. We will update it for future webinars, but just if you say, yeah, it's an older thing, yeah, we do recognize that. But V3 has been just introduced about 3-4 months ago, and still actually not being communicated in its entirety properly to the industry. So we're waiting until the water clears up a little bit before we do that. But it is a very, very, very important topic, especially when we're talking about enterprise architecture requirements. So if we go back to that ADM wheel in the middle, remember I had this big R? Well, this big R comes from this kind of activity. So you are actually embedding a framework within a framework, right? In effort, remember, to make it your own. So you are following, business analysis, body of knowledge, and you are basically establishing the preliminary considerations. You're analyzing the enterprise. You're looking at requirement planning. You're working with your stakeholders to actually elicit requirements, analyze them, document them, validate them, eventually test them and develop them and make sure that they are properly documented, assessed, communicated, and managed, right? All of this activity you're doing as part of requirement management within the architecture development method. So remember when I said that besides, at one point your architecture work is done, right? Based on all of the different activities that you perform. And then we say that now, it's going to be implemented, physically translated, implemented by a number of different frameworks. Well, ITIL is one of those frameworks. Of course, we don't have a whole lot of time to go through the entire consideration, but nevertheless, this is a service life cycle. It's based on, 5 stages, 5 phases, for those of you who are not aware of it. And it includes a number of different processes. So these are the different, phases: strategy, design, transition, operation, and continual improvement. And the pink boxes at the bottom, this is where your bodies, your people, are working in functional groups, right? This is pretty much ITIL in one big picture, where you see quickly going through, the portfolio or the list of services throughout their life cycle. So ITIL is concerned about, the pipeline or service strategy, your service catalog, or what you currently deliver, and eventually the retired services or things that you don't want to push to market anymore. Each one of these phases is associated with a number of processes, right? these different processes, of course, has to be integrated. In other words, you need to establish the proper interfaces, right, of what these processes are all about. And you're going to have some sort of a tool that support all of those activities. It's a service lifecycle approach. So basically, we're translating whatever enterprise architecture is introducing, to strategic and design type of information. And over time, the delivery at the end of the day is going to be services that are kind of supportive of your business needs and business requirements. Okay. In terms of governance and control, very quickly, we have a framework we call COBIT, and COBIT stands for Control Objectives, right? For IT, and today it's version 5. And it's all about pretty much governance and control. So ITIL looks at the definition of processes and the definition of services, while COBIT looks at the controls and governance of those processes through the use of, as an example, capability maturity model. COBIT is based on 5 principles, where I need to understand what you need as a stakeholder. I cover, the consideration of the enterprise end to end. I'm trying as much as I can to use an integrated framework. So instead of having multiple different frameworks, I integrate, right, and I call it my own, enable a holistic approach, and basically separate governance from management because of conflict of interest. These are the 5 basic principles of COBIT as a governance and control framework. So straightforward, really, meeting the stakeholder need is basically to make sure that we support benefit realization, risk optimization, and resources optimization. All of this is going to be cascaded to goals, associated with the enterprise, with IT, and of course, associated with other goals to enable, right? What you see on the right-hand side here, those are different portions of the framework itself that you will get exposed to once you get into the actual certification program. Basically, second principle when we're talking about end-to-end, so we have 2 main focus. One focus is, again, the governance side. Another focus is the roles and the activities, so the relationship from owner and stakeholder all the way to operation, as well as the feedback. And as you probably know, as you probably have seen, this concept has been hammered on by many different best practices, by Lean, by ITIL, by COBIT, by, enterprise architecture. They all talk about pretty much, what we call the left to right and right to left concept, where pretty much you're translating the abstract onto physical deliverables at the end of the day in a controlled manner. Integrated framework. So now when you are using a collection of frameworks, all to enable, COBIT and COBIT related activities, right, in terms of the different, family members that they have. So being it COBIT 5 itself, being it the enabler guides or the professional guide, they have different levels of certifications associated with all of these things. And of course, at high level, we're looking at, processes, at capabilities, at people's skills, policies, principles, information. They're all enablers associated with the subject matter. We talked about holistic approach. So basically, we're considering all of these different areas, again, people, process, technologies, as well as your organizational structure and your overall cultural aspect that COBIT talks about. And finally, what we look at here in terms of governance, split into two main portions. Again, governance in terms of directing, evaluating, and monitoring, and in terms of managing the day-to-day aspect. So when you see the details associated with all of these domains, you're going to see almost 60, if not more than that, % overlap with ITIL, right? I believe Sunil can share the deck in a PDF format with you. When you do get that, you're going to see that all of these different domains, right, have almost 50, 60% overlap with the ITIL framework. This is pretty much, the overall of our webinar. One very important topic before I open the floor for questions is that you need to use what we call a continual service improvement approach. And this approach is pretty much identified as a result of the Deming cycle based on Plan, Do, Check, Act. As a matter of fact, in terms of how you're going to get there, you're going to get there through that specific set of activities. So you need to understand vision and mission. You need to know your baseline. You need to know your target. You need to know how to get there, and that happens through Plan, Do, Check, Act. How, whether you got there or not, and how you're going to confirm, and then keep your momentum going, keep things hot so that your business is willing to continue spend the money on those programs. All right, very good. Well, I do appreciate your attendance. If you run into any questions for which you need answers, please don't hesitate. You can communicate with CTC Train Canada, and we'll be more than happy to respond back to your inquiries, being it at any of the topics that we discussed, or being it for any of the training curriculum that we have as well. Thank you very much. Have yourself a good afternoon, and hoping to see you over a future webinar as well. Take care.